All right, about time to get started. We're not going to have a class, of course, next week, nor the week after. So keep that in mind. In fact, it may be that this is the last class for the year. I'm not sure, but we're not having one next week because of the brunch. We won't have a class either on Christmas Eve. We'll just have a service that morning. So okay, so since we're not having class for the next couple of weeks, I thought today I would try and kind of wrap up the subject of how to understand the wrath of God. We've looked at it somewhat for a few weeks, and I'm going to try and pull that together today. So I really think that the wrath of God has to be reinterpreted in light of Jesus. You don't start in the Old Testament scriptures and define the wrath of God and then try and make Jesus fit with it. You start with Jesus, and then after Jesus, then you look back and say, how does that modify the way perhaps people thought of and talked about the wrath of God? And so I like what Father Thomas Hopko, an Eastern Orthodox theologian, said in his catechism that he drew up. He said, the wrath of God is how stubborn, sinful people experience his love. You know, and that's a good point. The point is, it's all the love of God. But if you're really incorrigible, then God lovingly is going to deal with you in a way that you're probably going to interpret as wrath, right? And I think that's probably a pretty accurate way of thinking about it. So when we look at Jesus, we don't see a wrathful Jesus. We talked about the cleansing of the temple, and that's not a wrathful thing. That's a prophetic enactment of something. That's why the religious leaders come to him and ask him about what he just did. You know, they didn't arrest him for being a madman who's gone loose in the temple. And so if we look at Christ, we don't see this, kind of wrath, at least as we imagined it when reading some of those Old Testament stories. But I thought today what I would do is look at a particular passage and try and understand it perhaps in a way that is helpful. And so the passage I thought we'd look at is Matthew 13. Matthew 13, we're going to look at 36 through 43, because if something sounds like, if Jesus doesn't display personally some sort of wrath, which is kind of like God is patient, and then God loses it. God is like, okay, enough with patience, enough with love and forgiveness, now comes wrath. If Jesus never displays that, someone might say, but doesn't he sort of talk about that? So let's look at this passage, which could be understood in those terms, and then I want us to look at how I think it ought to be understood. So I'm in Matthew 13, beginning in 36. Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him and said, explain to us the parable of the tares of the field. And he said, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. So now he's giving an interpretation. He didn't do it for the crowds. He just told them the story and left them to ponder it. To think about it, to wonder what it meant. But the disciples are saying, give us insight. Which shows the disciples didn't have a clue is really what it meant. Or if they had a clue, they weren't sure, and they wanted to know, so tell us exactly what this story is about. So he said, verse 37, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man, and the field is the world. And as for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom, and the tares are the sons of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil, and the harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. So just as the tares are gathered up and burned with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send forth his angels. They will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness and throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. And so, what do we do with this kind of passage? How do we understand it? How do we understand this in light of what we've been talking about? And I think the way to understand this passage is to go back and look at an Old Testament passage that I think echoes it. Because Jesus isn't speaking in a vacuum, right? He's not just saying things for the very first time. He's always offering, as it were, commentary. Is there something?
They can't hear.
Okay. See if they can hear now. See, he's not speaking in a vacuum. He's talking in a context with a lot of history already behind it. And so you could say, well, this seems like, wrath of God sort of stuff, doom, condemnation. Isn't that what Jesus is talking about? So let's look back. I want us to look at Malachi. We're going to look at Malachi starting in chapter 3. We're going to look at a couple places in Malachi and see what he talks about. Because I don't know if specifically Jesus is offering what he says in this parable, if he's doing that, specifically in light of Malachi. But I think Malachi is good background. It's good background understanding of the milieu of the kinds of things that have been talked about in Judaism, and he's offering a version of it. Okay? So I'm going to start in Malachi 3, and let's look at the first 6 verses of Malachi 3. Behold, I am going to send my messenger, and he will clear the way before me. And the Lord, whom you seek, will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant, in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming? And who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire, and like fuller's soap. He will sit as a smelter and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, so that they may present to the Lord offerings in righteousness. Okay, so far, you've got this kind of a parable-like illustration that the prophet is putting forth. And what do you notice the prophet says is going to happen?
It would be like a smelter, like a refining fire.
Okay. A smelter is someone who takes raw ore and processes it with fire so that you burn out the impurities and you end up with the pure, real, valuable metal that you're desiring. So when you dig gold out of the ground, it doesn't come out as pure gold. Yeah, it's contaminated with other items, other elements or other minerals, but you put it through the fire and you burn out all the other elements and you end up with the pure, gold, and everything else is gone. You've purified it. Okay? So the picture that Malachi presents is, yes, God is going to be like the smelter. That's the person who does this work of purifying the raw ore so that you end up with the genuine, pure metal, whatever you want, gold or silver. So verse 3, he will sit as a smelter and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, so that they may present to the Lord offerings in righteousness. Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to the Lord, as in the days of old, as in former years. Then I will draw near to you for judgment. Wait, judgment's happening after the purification? Right? Then I will draw near to you for judgment. So the work of God is to on the front end do this purification work, and then God comes to judge, right? After he's purifying, right? And I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers and against the adulterers. And adulterers here probably means not sexual, it means religious, unfaithful ones. Where Israel is viewed as the spouse of God, and the Israelites as God's bride, and God is the bridegroom. And so here the metaphor of the adulterers has more to do with those who are unfaithful to God in this marriage of God to his betrothed, to his wife, Israel. So that's probably what he has in mind. So, and against the adulterers, and against those who swear falsely, and against those who oppress the wage earner in his wages, against the widow and the orphan, and those who turn aside the alien and do not fear me, says the Lord of hosts. For I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore, O sons of Jacob, therefore you, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed. Okay, so what is it? Now think about verse 6. So he's saying, I'm going to refine, I'm going to burn out the impurities, I'm going to deal with all these things. But as he's talking about it, he says in verse 6, I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore you, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed. So what?
That's cool.
Yeah. So you hear what he's saying? He's saying, because I don't change, I don't utterly destroy you. Now, I'm going to consume your impurities like a smelter would burn off all the impurities to end up with the pure metal. Like fire the gold ore so you can get rid of everything else and just end up with the pure gold. That's what I'm going to do to Israel. And the reason you're not destroyed is because I don't change. Right? It's not like I called you and then decided, I've had it. The thing is, I don't change. I'm consistent. I'm true to my promises, and therefore I'm going to purify you. I'm not going to utterly destroy you. I'm going to purify you like a smelter would purify the raw ore to end up with the pure metal. Mm-hmm. Now, interestingly enough, that brings up the metaphor of the fire, right? The fire of purification, not the fire of utter destruction, but the fire of purification. Because what you have to do is you have to fire the ore in a furnace, you have to burn off the impurity, and then you end up with the genuine metal. And the prophet is using this as the metaphor. Right? Does that make sense? Follow the metaphor? So Israel is going to be purified, and all the impurities are going to be burned out. And what's going to be left is genuine and true to God. And all their sins, all their sorceries and all their unfaithfulness will all be done away with, so that God can end up with the pure, right? Having purified his own people. All right, thoughts or questions so far? I mean, this is 400 years before Jesus, right?
Yeah, I really love this whole idea that, people who are already saved, I mean, I see it at work all the time. They come in and they're filled with guilt and shame. And part of my job is always showing the love of God and his approachable heart. But this idea that he has cleansed it, and therefore how can he judge you?
Yeah.
He has done the work, so why are you walking in a condemnation?
Right. Yeah, the irony is the tender-hearted people always feel condemned, And the hard-hearted people always feel fine.
Yeah.
It's the hard-hearted people who are not worried about it because they're pretty confident. And the tender-hearted people are like, oh, no. And the tender-hearted people are the ones you're always assuring in your kind of role. You're always saying, no, you're fine. You're okay. You're tender-hearted. They take seriously all their imperfections and feel horrible about them and feel like God can't love me, and I've disappointed God because they're tender-hearted. And the ones who really need the purification are the ones who feel fine. I feel fine. And I really think the prophets are talking about the ones who I feel fine. They're the ones who we got to burn out all the impurities to end up with the pure metal because they do feel fine. So it's this ironic position that like you're in, that I'm often in, is the people coming to you feeling just so awful. You're always reassuring them, no, you're fine. Not that everything you're aware of real sin in your life and stuff, but you're fine because you're tenderhearted and you're welcoming the refining work of God. And then the people who don't come are the ones who feel fine, but they're the really ones who need the refining, right? But
they're the ones that God has to use, like myself, who has to use a sledgehammer on.
Yeah.
Can't just tap them on the shoulder with a ruler and say you can straighten up.
How big is your sledgehammer?
Huh?
How big is your sledgehammer?
Not to beat me to death, just a real hard tap. Like, hello, you're not that good.
Yeah. And that's the irony of it. The people who are most distressed about passages of Scripture that seem harsh are the ones who need to be least distressed because they're tenderhearted. And the people who blow them off are the people who really need to realize there's things in their lives need to change, right? But I think that, so the picture going on here, what God says through the prophet Malachi in verse 6, I do not change. That's why you are not consumed, utterly destroyed, because I'm faithful. I'm going to refine you like the smelter refining the ore. Dig ore out of the ground. It's got impurities. I've got to put it through the fire. I've got to refine it. I've got to get rid of the impurities. And then you end up with the pure gold, pure silver. And that becomes the analogy of God working with people, right? So there is the kind of judgment, but it is always judgment for our benefit, right? Right? It's always judgment for our benefit. So we have that picture here in the early parts of Malachi 3 about this. Now skip down to verse, because then there's some intervening parts where he kind of pictures the obstinance of the people going, when do we do that? And he keeps saying, well, this is when you did that. Well, when do we do that? So the prophet takes, I'm going to skip that part, where the people are kind of like, I didn't think we were guilty of anything. And the prophet's saying, oh, yes, but you have done these things, right? But you come down to verse 16. Verse 16, then those who feared the Lord spoke to one another, and the Lord gave attention and heard it, and a book of remembrance was written before him for those who fear the Lord and who esteem his name. They will be mine, says the Lord of hosts, on the day that I prepare my own possession, and I will spare them as a man spares his own son who serves him. So you will again distinguish between the righteous and the wicked, between one who serves God and one who does not serve him. Then chapter 4, because, of course, the chapter breaks are, later entered in, so Malachi did not imagine a major break at this point. So keep on reading. For behold, the day is coming, burning like a furnace. Okay, the smelter refines the ore, right? That was the earlier analogy. For behold, the day is coming, burning like a furnace, and all the arrogant and every evildoer will be like chaff, and the day that is coming will set them ablaze. He's going to refine this ore, right? He sits as, and that's what we saw earlier in chapter 3, he's the purifier of the metal. And he's got to burn out its impurities so that you can get rid of everything except the silver you're working with. so you can get rid of all the other impurities. And so that's the picture. Here's God purifying. So he goes on to say, so I will set them ablaze. But again, this is the purifying work of God in the context. This is the smelter burning out the impurities of the ore. I will set them ablaze, says the Lord of hosts, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch. I'm not going to leave a bit of that which needs to go. But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in his wings, and you will go forth and skip and be like calves from the stall. I mean, joyous will be your response to being purified. So this is the kind of picture that Malachi talks about, and I think that Jesus then is referencing when we started with what Jesus is saying, right? What Jesus is saying is he's saying it against a background of this purifying, refining work of God, and that's the context then in which he starts to say what we saw in Matthew 13. So let's go back then to Matthew 13 and see if this isn't the context that we need to use to help us, right? So back to Matthew 13, verse 41. The Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. But he's got background for this, right? He's not saying this in a vacuum, right? And the furnace of fire is where you burn the impurities out of the metal you want to have. Like, so if you get gold ore, it doesn't come out of the ground absolute 100% gold ore. It comes out with other minerals and dirt, and you mine out this ore, but it's ore. It's not pure yet. And the furnace is how you purify the ore. And at the end of the process, you get this beautiful, pristine metal that you wanted all along, with all the other parts removed now. So in verse 41, the Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Yeah, Dave?
I was, just thinking, we kind of, we're reading this as Jesus having a background, but when you read Malachi didn't really have any background of Jesus, and so he's speaking with kind of what he knew and understood at that point, And so I think, I wonder, because we sort of have this, there's sort of this turn or burn version of the gospel.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
If you don't turn, you're going to burn. And
Right.
You're going to be burned up in that fire. And I wonder, looking at it from the way you're explaining it, the weeping of gnashing of teeth, is that, possibly speaking to the regret that I could have started the process of being refined instead of it having it now. I've held on to the wrong things,
Right.
And what I've held on to is going to be burned up.
Yeah.
And this, is that where that fits in?
Well, I think so, okay? Because there's two possibilities here in 42 and 43, right? And I can tell you the way I was taught to read it, right? The way I was taught to read it was, so there's one group of people, they go into the furnace of fire, there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth, now that's a quote, as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. And that's another group of people, right? That's how I was taught to read it, right? So you don't want to be the doomed people who go into the furnace forever. You want to be the people who watch that transpire, and then you get to skip off to glory, right? But what if that's the same group of people? And what if the then is after the furnace of purification? That's another way to read it, right? I wasn't taught to read it that way. But I actually think it's a better way to read it. And so what's happening, the then is, then those people, it's not like then the other people who stood by and watched those people get tossed into the furnace. No, what if it's those people then having been purified, all the impurities burned out like a smelter? Going back to Malachi, okay, so we got to take this ore, which is full of contaminants, we got to put it in the furnace, you got to heat that thing up, you got to burn out the impurities, and then you end up with the pure ore. That's what Malachi is talking about. What if Jesus, not in a vacuum, but with that kind of background, throws out his parables, right? His analogies. And he says, yeah, there's got to be this furnace of fire, which we have been, I was taught to equate with everlasting hell rather than equate with the process of burning out impurities of even me, the faithful, right? It's not like the punishment of the loss, but what if this is the process of me having to learn to let go of the things that are trash anyway, and the ridiculousness of the things I have held on to, that has to be all taken out so that I can be pure. What if the then in verse 43 is the same group of people? And this isn't just me. I can pull up church fathers who read it this way, right? It's not like, this is something that Greg came up with in, 2023. There is a whole history of Christian tradition. Now, it often is the minority position, because the majority position was often, it's either win or lose eternally. But there's always been a minority position that said, no. It's all about God purifying his people.
Is this similar to purgatory?
Yes, some sort of, which is there in the Roman church. They made that a major part of their thinking, is that there's the purging. And I really think, my reading is this is a picture not of there are some who are eternally saved and some who are eternally lost. It's a parable of all of us have to be purified sooner or later, right? If we're going to share in the life of God, we're going to have to at some point. Now you can put it off, you can delay it, but at some point the impurities have to be refined out of us, right? They have to go. And so I've come around, and again, not because I thought it up, because I read some church fathers and others who read it this way, and it was astounding to me. It's like, they're reading it this way, right? So I think the idea here then is what God must do is he must refine all of us. And you can start early or you can put it off, but you're still going to have to go through that process, one way or another. Okay.
So the fire is there all the time, from beginning to end, and we just have to choose to walk into it.
Yeah. And think about how God appears to Moses as a burning bush. God is the fire. The Holy Spirit descends on the 12 day of Pentecost as tongues of fire. God identifies with the fire. So if what we have often said, well, the fire is separation from God, maybe the fire is the intensity of God's love, which then loves us too much to leave us unchanged. I think that's often the kind of metaphor we have going. So God often he showed up as a pillar of fire to the Israelites at night, fire, a cloud during the day to lead them. So God has often come to his people as a fire, as a refining fire, and to make us who we need to be, and to burn out the impurities and to set us right. So I think you can read it that way. What?
It's not destroying fire.
It destroys anything that's not of God. Yeah. It'll destroy all my evil works and all my evil thoughts and all my, everything that is worthless, it will burn up. And like the refiner in Malachi, what you're left with, you get rid of all the impurities, and what are you left with? Pure gold, pure silver, no more impurities. Right?
Your interpretation would be how I want to interpret it, and I do interpret it. But if you go back to the beginning of the same explanation of the parable, he talks about, the weeds, and he's referencing, this is Jesus' own explanation of his parable, right? But he's saying it's the difference between the weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the good seed are the sons, which would imply, to me anyway, and people, right? I mean, it's easier to say that's a person as opposed to an impurity. I can get there as a metaphor, but
Yeah.
But he talks about the weeds being burned up, which right before was the sons of the evil one, right? So how do you bring that part of that into because that's not a purification, it doesn't seem to be, unless you make people metaphorically not people, but.
Well, or like when Paul talks about it, he talks about the works of some are silver and gold and things that last, and the works of others are like straw. And those will escape as through the flames, but their works will be burned up. So Paul envisions everyone's work will be tested. And some people's work is like the precious metal, and it passed the test. And some people's works are just completely consumed because it was all worthless, right? So, yeah, if we read it not only here but in the larger context, and that's the hard part, is I have to start linking it together with, well, what does Paul say when he talks about there are some whose works are like gold and silver, great, some is like straw, burned up, but they escape, he says, as through the flames. So, well, where are the people, Paul, where do you talk about the people who don't escape through the flames which burn up their worthless works? Who are those? He didn't even mention them. Well, isn't that the majority? I mean, it's just, we've got that template, we're trying to fit what Jesus says or what Paul says into that template. I'm just suggesting the possibility of start thinking that maybe there's a different kind of pattern to which Paul is speaking there in Corinthians when he says the same thing, to which Jesus' parables are speaking, which harken back to Malachi, right? So, yeah, I'm just...
I like Jim's...
Yeah.
Because it was the same sort of thing I was thinking about. Excuse me for shouting it out. But in the New Testament, God is light, is shown literally as light. I mean, the light came on Paul, they didn't know, it wasn't fire. I mean, it was light. Jesus is talking to Moses in light, that they were there, not fire. Yet in the Old Testament, I'm just trying to think, is there an example of that where it's just light as opposed to fire? So is it, what is that difference between Old Testament God showing up in fire, not burning you, but in the New Testament, God showing up as light, which I think everybody would think is more harmless, as that, unless of course it was a laser beam.
And then maybe we're pushing the metaphor too far. What kind of light was this? It was generated from what kind of source? Well, now obviously we've missed the fact. It's a metaphor, It's a metaphor.
But is that, I don't know if I'm asking it right, but it just seems like, I want to agree with you, but I'm kind of with Jim. But at the same time, it's burning up something.
Yeah, and it's very, so that would be the question. I don't think you can take this in isolation, obviously. But my sense is, so we've been talking about this, the larger subject that we've been talking about, okay, and how we bring it down. I think there's a possibility to looking at it. What is Jesus saying when he throws out this illustration? I think what he says to the tender-hearted, we're back. We kind of interestingly where the discussion started, right? Which had nothing to do with the text today. There's tender-hearted people who always feel horrible about everything. And to those people you say, there, you're doing great. Stop feeling so distraught over your mistakes. You are tender-hearted and you're trying to do everything right. And then there's the hard-hearted people who don't even give a second thought to what they're doing and just do it anyway, right? And that irony is just present in us. And there may be something about which I am tender-hearted and some other issue about which I am hard-hearted, right? It's not like I'm totally one or the other. So sometimes I could be the person, so inclined to mourn my mistakes, and other places I just might be kind of calloused and hard. I think there's a sense in what Jesus often does is to the tenderhearted, he speaks words of comfort and consolation. Yeah, consolation. You said the word consolation, like they're there. I know it's a struggle. I know you feel bad. I comfort you, with the love of God and the mercy of God. And then there's other people who are hard nuts to crack. And those have to be won over by the stronger love of God, right? In the sense of, so as Hopko, the Eastern Orthodox theologian, said it, that harsher treatment is how the stubborn experience the love of God, right? Which seems to be harsher, but it's still how God manifests his love to someone not inclined to receive it. And so the love of God comes to that person in this kind of stronger vein. If I'm trying to read the larger context, just the whole, not just this one isolated one, I put it in that kind of framework, that everything is God trying to heal me and win me over. And that has to do with my starting place. If I'm tenderhearted, I get lots of, there, Greg. Stop stressing. Stop worrying about every little mistake. Stop being scrupulous. Like, I did another little thing wrong. It's okay. You're cared for and loved by God. But if I'm the person who kind of cavalierly casts off my behavior as, it doesn't matter. What I do to my neighbor is not that big a deal. God has to come to me in a different way to make me a person who's tenderhearted and who realizes I mistreat others and things like that. I think, to me, that's the sense that we have to bring to the text.
When I'm praying, I've usually used like the thing of light where God sort of for my kids and prayer, protection, and this light and everything. And what you're saying is, go ahead and pray that they're in a fire and that the impurities are being
and for all of us.
gotten out of them.
Right. For all of us, if
It's gonna be a hard one.
we long to be purified, this fire is not there to harm us. It's there to set us right, to make us the people that God wants us to be. That's the Malachi image. He's the purifier of the sons of Levi, right? Burning out their impurities. So when Jesus starts using this language, he's not doing it in a vacuum. Malachi's 400 years previous. He's reflecting on that kind of context, those images which have already been put out there. I think what Jesus often does to his disciples, it's like that they're there. I know life is tough, and the Pharisees think you're all heretics, and you're struggling as the few. God's care and love for you is assured. But to someone like the Pharisees, he's like, well, there's some stuff that's got to get burned out here. Your self-assuredness, your ego, your disdain for anyone less than yourself, that's got to go, right? That's not compatible. So that's my sense of kind of how it all works out. But you can't just in one passage. But there's some, I think Jesus is some who they really need that because, like I said, the tenderhearted don't need it because they're already tenderhearted. They already feel horrible about every little thing they do. right? If you've raised children and you have a child who's like that versus one who's kind of stubborn and not inclined to take your correction, I mean, it's two different experiences, right? I'm not saying I had two like that, but, but I'm just,
Periodically.
yeah, kind of hypothetically. You can have the child that's really a harder one to parent, and then there's a tenderhearted child who takes everything so personally, and so, and that one you're always building up, like, you're encouraging that child. The other one you're trying to other people have needs too. It's like that one's just like me. It's all about me, right? That one you gotta work with differently. I'm just saying, yeah, that's kind of, I think, reflected, and Jesus is talking about that in the text. Yeah. So, Deb.
I kind of see it like it's kind of paradoxical that I see like the fire, and that it's like tough love, but also unconditional love. And like Alan was talking about, I see like the fire and the light as the same thing, like two sides of the same coin.
Right.
Because it's all love.
Yeah.
That's what it makes me think of.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think of it. The love of God is intense, and it will harbor nothing that is not of itself. Now, if I am tender-hearted, I'm welcoming that. Yes, Lord, refine me in the fire of your love. Refining fire, the song goes. We're like, yay, the refining fire. And then there's other people who don't want to be refined. They want to grip tightly the things, and it's only pulled from their hands grudgingly, right? Because they're not inclined to say, yes, Lord, take it from me. They're like, no, I don't want to lose it. I think all of that's, because Jesus is saying this in the context of Israel, right? And they're all God's people. But there's some who are tender-hearted and there's some who are hard-hearted, right? Okay, Marcia, you had a...
Well, what it makes me, I guess, think of, and if I'm understanding correctly, is God's destroying the works, the attitudes, the things we don't need. He's not destroying the person.
Right.
Because like we love our children, but God loves us. He doesn't destroy the person.
Right.
He might try to destroy the things that are not making them who they need to be as a loving person.
Yeah. Because if we're all created, and we are, that if is not throwing it into question. It is saying it is only the logical process. If we are all created in the image of God, and we are, so there is an irreducible image of our God residing in each one of us, which is good. Now, how far buried that is under well, often what's done to us, not what we did, but what was done to us, which then resulted in us doing certain things out of the patterns of how we were treated. That image of God that we each bear may be buried deep, deep within a shell of all sorts of life experiences and being mistreated and therefore mistreating others. And it may be almost, well, maybe to our eyes, completely concealed. I can't even see anything, of worth in this person. But we, by faith, have to know, but this is still a person created in the image of God, and that image still resides here. Now, maybe it's under layers and layers that has to be smelted away, right, in the furnace of God's love.
That smelting's never pleasant.
It's never there's a reason it's the metaphor it is. It's not like, oh, I just naturally gravitate to all the good things of God. I don't, right? And everywhere I don't, that's a tough place for me. Because God, because, for example, and then we're going to have to stop. For example, I by nature, not by God's creative work, but by the nature that has built up to be who I am, I can be a judgmental person, just by nature. Maybe that's part of, the way I think or whatever. And sometimes I don't want the love of God to go to everybody, right? Right? And I just want them to get what's coming to them, right? Oh, they don't deserve it. And that's a part of me that is unlike God. Because everyone is a child of God. I may not want that person to be a recipient of God's mercy and love. I may want them to get what they deserve. But see, that's a part of me that's totally out of step with my Father. And that part of me's got to go, right? That part of me, that judgmental part of me's got to go. And that will be a refining process. That's me going through the smelter's work of burning out the impurities. Where someone else, and often the people I see as like that, are people whose outward behaviors may appear to be more contaminated than mine, right? Because I can be self-righteous because I grew up Christian and, in a preacher's home and all this, and we were good. So I can be so judgmental and look down on others. That's the part that's got to get smelted out of me by the refiner's fire. But I can often see myself, I'm pure metal, I'm the real deal. They're the ones who have the obvious sins. Look at how they live. And ironically, yes, something has to go for them, but something has to go for me. That part of me has got to go into the furnace, get burned away, so that what can be emerging out of that process is someone who is true to the heart of God. If we, it's just possible to read these passages that way. If 43 says, then the righteous will shine. Who are they? Are they the people who went into the furnace of fire, or are they the people who watched others go into it? I think now it's the people who've been through the furnace of fire. It's all of us. Who doesn't need some impurities burned out? So all of us go in. Now, the more I resist it, the more God has to do that furnace. Surrender early, right? Surrender early, give up. I give up, Lord, So if you read it that way, then, everyone's got to be purified. And God lovingly does the work for all of us, right? So then you can read 43 as, then the righteous. Who are they? They are the ones who've been through that furnace of the fire of God's love, because God is often present as a fire, burning away the impurities. And he does that to make us better people, right? The people we need to be. That's a possible reading of all of this, right? Which then puts we started on the whole subject that we started with was the wrath of God. That puts it all in a possibly different context. Now, okay, so I'll just have to stop here. But what I'll say as well is, I cannot prove to anyone beyond the shadow of a doubt this is the way to read it. I know there's an alternative reading. It's the one I grew up with. Right? But I also can see this is a possible reading, which I was completely unaware of, because I thought, well, like it or not, that's how it shakes out. And there's only a few ever saved, and most, are cast away by God, never to be redeemed. That's not the only reading. And it's possible that this is a way of also reading passages like this, right? Because the subject we started with was a few weeks ago was about how do we understand this wrath of God? And it seems different with Jesus than it was with some of the Old Testament passages. It seems to arrive at a new place with Jesus. It seems to me with Jesus, it's God's purifying work. So it's not like God loses his patience and then gives up on you. It's the intensity with which God pursues you, which I often feel like he's being wrathful. He's actually being a healer. But I don't like healing sometimes.
The fire is more like warmth.
Yes.
Than it is like burning.
Yeah, if I'm inclined to it, it's much more light and warmth. If I'm resistant, it seems like it's hurting me. That's only because I'm holding on to the impurities. If you read these passages that way, then it starts to look a little bit differently. And I'm just suggesting that as a possible reading. Okay, we need to stop. I know the ladies have a thing, so. All right.